Hi everyone, thanks for coming here to listen us talk about really dark things like dystopias. And I have here with me Gautam Bhatia, who, as you know, is a constitutional lawyer as well as a science fiction writer. He has been editing a science fiction magazine for many years and has now written two novels set in his own dystopian universe, The Wall and the Horizon. Gautam, we'll just start right away by, what is your idea of a dystopia and why are dystopias so popular at the moment? It feels like almost every sort of, from The Last of Us to any number of science fiction novels are all set in dystopias. Why are dystopias so popular, really?
Yeah, dystopias have been really an integral part of speculative fiction for a very long time. There is the classic trifecta of dystopias, 1984, Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451, that all came out together. And if you look at those three books, there are two common themes that stand out. One is, of course, the overweening authoritarian state, and the second is technology, and technology is a source of oppression. So the overweening state is a feature of 1984 and of Fahrenheit 451. And in Brave New World, of course, you have Soma, that that drug that puts everyone into a quiescent state. And so, if you look at the history of science fiction, you see that dystopias arose with the rise of the modern state and the rise of tech. And while on the one hand you had a lot of optimism around technology and how it would enable us to reach beyond ourselves, travel into space, a parallel tradition was the techno-pessimistic tradition. Right. And since then, both these concerns have only grown with time. Right. And modern dystopias, again, if you look at them, broadly have to do with these two concerns. A lot more now about tech and less about the state. But so post-apocalyptic dystopias, Octavia Butler, right. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, all those examples, right. They are, it's either a powerful state that then harnesses technology in various ways.
Right, right. So we are going through a sort of a, so the real world and the dystopian world, how are the lines blurring in our current scenario? And do you think we are actually living in a dystopia?
Yeah, so William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer, which initiated cyberpunk as a genre, had this very famous line. He said, "The future is here. It is unevenly distributed."
Right.
And again, so Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, for example, is often thought of as a grim prophetic story about what could happen if a certain kind of religious fundamentalism took root and what that would do for women's rights. And you often see, for example, in the US, when you have the abortion judgments, the comparison is to Gilead, right? But actually there is a whole strand of black feminist critique of The Handmaid's Tale, which points out how many of the things that Atwood posits as being in the future were done to black women across the years.
Happened to black women, yes.
Yeah, so I think that micro dystopias have always existed. And your world exists in and along those micro dystopias at all times.
Right, yeah, that's a very interesting viewpoint. In India of today, let's be a little like, let's just stir things up a little bit. In the India of today, do you see any elements of dystopia?
No, so I think again, it's the same thing, right? So micro dystopias exist all around us. So in Indian history and in the Indian present, there's always been a dystopia for some. Right. I think of course the distinction is that you tend to feel it when it expands in scope and size. So for example, what happened in 75, right, was just an expansion of a kind of dystopia that was already there for many people. Right. At a national scale. Yeah. And similarly now again what you have is, with this kind of a very overweening state, a similar kind of expansion of dystopia. So I think that in that sense it's never one dystopia existing at any given time.
Yeah, because in fiction it's kind of course, imperative on the author to create something so large and so sort of overwhelming that it makes narrative sense. But in the real world, there are micro sort of dystopic elements happening everywhere, right?
Yeah, so a lot of good science fiction, I think good contemporary science fiction, actually is more micro dystopic than the 1984 type of, overarching one. So for example, S.P. Divya's Machinehood, a recent book, is set in the near future of when this corporate personhood and the line between the cyborg and the machine and the human being is very blurred. And her book actually, there is just a whole set of micro dystopias. It moves between the US and Chennai, and you don't see this, great state or this like one large dystopia, everyone's under the boot, but you navigate multiple small, tiny ones. Ray Naylor's Mountain in the Sea, again, another recent book. The premise is wonderful. It's basically climate change accelerates evolution under the sea, and you have sentient octopi, and it's about human-octopus contact. But the broader context is climate change. And you have, for example, there are 3 narratives. One is climate change affecting one island. So that's a micro-dystopia. The other is, for example, a ship, a sentient artificial intelligence-powered ship, which has indentured labor. So you bring together indentured labor and AI in one, but in the context of one ship, right? So you move between those vistas. I think that's much truer to the world we are in than the 1984 prognosis of this overarching one dystopia.
Dystopia, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the dystopia or the dystopian elements in your book. Tell us a little bit about The Wall and The Horizon, and what are some of the ways in which you have drawn from classical dystopian sort of elements and themes, and in some ways in which you have departed from it. And was that conscious? Like, did you want to make certain departures?
Yeah, so the Wall and the Horizon is a finished duology of 2 books, and the premise is that there is a city within a very large wall, and no one's ever gone beyond that, and within living memory, and no one knows what's beyond that, and there is a strong both religious and secular proscription against going beyond that, because actually life within is fairly okay, and the unknown is outside. So that's in a sentence the premise.
Since I reviewed your book, I mean, and I found that very chilling, that, it was not a completely like negative place. I mean, there were elements of utopia even, inside that. But at the same time, that there is, whenever somebody is stopping you from knowing something wrong is happening, right?
Yeah, so the tradition that these books belong to is broadly a tradition called the ambiguous utopia. So Ursula Le Guin, who is one of the all-time great science fiction writers.
Lois Lowry's the Giver.
Yeah, as well, yeah. So she wrote a book called The Dispossessed, which is what she calls an ambiguous utopia. So The Dispossessed basically is an anarchist society that actually has managed to put in place the principles of anarchism. So it looks like a utopia in the sense that everybody is equal. There is no poverty. There is no inequality. You distribute work through work shifts. So it looks like you have managed to eliminate the major drivers of human conflict. But then when you go deeper into it, you find that even in an anarchist society, there are hierarchies, there are power structures. You have to still keep people to their roles in ways that, and you can't apply force, so you apply other kinds of pressures.
But there's other manipulations.
Yeah, exactly. So through the course of the book, what begins as a harsh but fair utopia dissolves into something much more, ambiguous and perhaps uneasy, right? And so similarly, I think that the idea is that every society has elements of both the utopia and dystopia. And I think, again, the science fiction I like is one that has elements of both.
And that's what you drew your universe from?
So yeah, so in the sense that it's a utopia in the sense that, again, there is no poverty or inequality in that sense. You do have hierarchies, there are structures, but the balance of resources is such that no one goes hungry. There is no, in that sense, there is no oppression, right? So in most of your classic dystopias, there is grinding oppression that either leads to a revolution or to a very bleak world. Right? So in 1984, ultimately, the oppressors win. In Fahrenheit 451, you escape. Right? And in modern dystopias, again, Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, there is a sense of escape. Right?
And the Testament kind of brings you to
so I think that I wanted to avoid that. And the question was that, okay, even if you have a utopian kind of a situation where you don't lack for anything, what would then still trigger possible human conflict or the desire to go beyond that society? So in that sense, the mixture of the utopia and the dystopian elements.
Right. Yeah. Before the session, I was talking with my friend Samit Basu, one of the original sort of OG science fiction writers from India. And I asked him if he had any questions for Gautam. So he came up with a very interesting question, actually. So he was like, your novels are intensely political. Like there are lots of political themes in that, which, so what, I mean, Sumit's question was, how do you create characters which are characters, flesh and blood characters in themselves, and not just, sort of mouthpieces for ideas? Is that a challenge?
Yeah, so science fiction has always been intensely political, even though there is a dominant narrative that it's not been. So Frankenstein, which is supposed to be the OG science fiction novel, there's a great book called The Blood in the Machine about the Luddites, and actually Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, her entire social circle was the Luddites, the anti-machine folks, right? And yeah. And actually, Frankenstein has been analyzed to be the first Luddite science fiction novel. So from the beginning, politics is inherent in science fiction, and in the mid 20th century, science fiction became a byword for empire because you had your going into other planets and having first contact. So it's always been political, and I think that the challenge is, as with any other novel form, that fine distinction between a novel of ideas and turning people into caricatures is, I think, not a problem unique to SF. It's just that I think in SF, because you are allowed to tweak the world in certain ways, it can end up being perhaps more, in some ways, more driven by world building, and the politics comes into that, and making the characters a bit secondary. So I think that is a bit of a challenge always.
But how do you overcome that? Like in your novel, I mean, was it something that you were conscious of when you were writing? And what are some of the ways that, I'm sure we have writers here. I mean, what are some of the ways that you would use to kind of, make those characters more real?
Yeah, I think there are many ways. So one, of course, is the classic technique that Ursula Le Guin often says, which is read aloud your prose to yourself, right? So often one very common ways in which this manifests itself, this problem, is that your characters then begin to talk like, mouthpieces for an idea, demagogues, or just caricatures of a particular political idea. And you will realize that if you read it out to yourself, because spoken language is always very different from written language. And so if you just read out your passages, and this is a recommendation Le Guin makes in her books on craft, you will spot where they are becoming caricatures.
Atonality sort of.
Yeah, it'll come out. Otherwise, of course, having good, honest readers and good editors is going to, make sure that's sort of weeded out. So I mean, I've always had, very critical readers of the first draft who help to weed out those, lingering caricaturish parts of your characters in that.
Yeah, which actually makes me think. I mean, so you are a constitutional lawyer, who writes a lot about. The ways in which that we are failing our constitution in some ways. You are sometimes an LGBTQ activist, and how do these worlds sort of come together? How does your other job, your other roles, how do they feed your writing?
Yeah, I can never escape the constitutional law, even in other worlds. No, I think that it's just that as far as constitutional law goes, it's just you just understand. You come to so much like an engineer writing science fiction would ensure that the design of the spaceship, is correct, and the hard science checks out and makes sense. So in that sense, the expertise plays into the world building. Similarly, having done constitutional law, you have a sense of how the underlying legal structures, pass on to the overarching political structures above. So you make sure that is consistent. But that's sort of the only influence it has. Otherwise, writing fiction is a completely different, technique. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your craft. I mean, the craft of writing. How do you practice it? What is your, do you have a very disciplined routine around it? Yeah. And, does that help, or do you think, how do you work?
So broadly, there are two kinds or two styles of writers, it's often said, gardeners and architects, or plotters and pantsers, right? So the architect is someone who has laid the foundations, done the outline, put up the pillars, does all that groundwork, and then builds the structure of the novel on the scaffolding. The gardener walks around the garden, and as they see, they prune as they see, and they sort of cut as they see. And similarly, the plotter is the one who plots in advance, and the pantser is the one seat of the pants. That's the origin of the phrase. Yeah,
Okay,
the pantser,
the pantser.
So flying,
like flying
by the seat of your pants.
seat of your
Yeah.
pants.
So that's what it's normally called. I've always been the gardener type. So I have this one idea or one image, and then it builds around that bit by bit. And always again, I think one lesson I've gotten that is great is that the first draft just has to exist. Right? So it needn't be good. It just has the first draft job is to exist. And then you make it, good and better over time. So if you're a gardener, then the first draft, is very important because you're writing it on the fly. So the first draft's often horrible. And the real work then begins in the months after you've done the first draft.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a fiction writer, but like I write for a living. And sometimes it's just important to have words on that screen, even if you are just copying your notes or like writing rubbish. But something you need to have because that blank page is the most scary dystopia.
And the other thing is that, that the blank, so I use Scrivener. Scrivener is a tool for fiction writers. Yeah, and the blank Scrivener page, the blank file when you open it is always a nightmare. The other thing I think is for science fiction specifically, you have to be always open to revising the world building because it's a bit like what in political philosophy they call reflexive equilibrium, where your abstract intuitions about the world and your concrete beliefs are always coming into equilibrium with each other. So you're revising both. So yeah, and in science fiction, therefore, you are creating the world, and then you have the events and the actual driver of the plot, and you have to keep on going back to make sure that the former is consistent with the latter. So I'll give you an example. Because in The Wall and the Horizon, because you have this bounded world, there's a question of resources. So you plan, how resources are meant to be distributed. And at one point, there's a bit of a revolution happening. And so the question is about weapons. And I realized that iron, it's very hard to have it in a closed loop kind of system. The only kind of iron which is renewable from a renewable source is bog iron in swamps, right? But the problem is that bog iron is very weak. It breaks very quickly. So then you can't have it for weapons, proper weapons. But then I found that the Vikings had this discovery where if they mixed their bones or of the dead Vikings with bog iron, it became strong. Right?
Bones also
and
contain
of course,
iron.
and bones obviously are renewable in this sort of a situation, right? So then you figure out, okay, this is how the weapons will exist. And that may happen at the very end of the process because you're figuring it out as you go along. So I think with science fiction, constantly being open to revising both the world and the events is very important as you write.
I mean, you're just working through the technicalities and like putting the rules of the universe in place.
Yeah,
right?
and the rules are obviously always flexible and changing. So you have to allow yourself to be open to that change even the day before you finish your draft.
Right. So I think we have a little time. Maybe we can take one or two questions also. But no, I have a last question. Sorry. Let me finish. No, so firstly, like, why are writers so attracted to dystopias? Like, what are some of the truths about our world? You have answered partly, but what are some of the truths about our world that dystopias allow us to explore? And secondly, why are dystopias so much more popular to write than utopias? Like, are utopias more difficult to write?
Yeah, I think that there are two functions that dystopias serve in our society. One is a warning, right? So this is where we will get to in the next 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years if you're not careful. 1984 was a warning, right? And you always have that popular meme, right? It's meant to be it's not an instruction manual, right? 1984. So
but some people use it as
exactly, right? So one is as a warning, and the other is to bring out certain truths of the world that are already there. Right? It's already exist in the world. And again, Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, example of that, right? So I think these are the two roles that dystopian fiction serves in our society. And why is it popular? I think one is that, of course, yeah. So I think utopias are much harder to write, and which is why we have many fewer Le Guin type ambiguous utopias in the tradition of science fiction and many more dystopias. I think just again there is a certain appeal to a kind of dark fiction that is across the board, right? So even in anime, manga, and all, I think that there is a certain appeal that kind of bleakness has in fiction, and dystopia is a science fiction articulation of that bleakness or that darkness that people enjoy I think, in fiction.
And also, but I think like, I mean, when we think of futuristic novels,
Yeah.
they're almost always dystopias. And sometimes it feels a little bleak that can we not imagine a happier future?
No, I think it's a bit of catharsis, right? So for the Greeks, for example, tragic theatre was catharsis. So I think dystopias, are popular because they, in a certain sense, apart from being a
Because
warning,
exorcise
yeah,
kind of.
they provide certain kind of catharsis, yeah.
Yeah.